Okay, how we doing, everyone? I hope everything's going well for you. Today we're gonna cover HR, human resource management. But before that, I'll talk a little for a second about the exam. Let me open up the roster. And so I put your exam up on Blackboard. It's in the course documents section, should be the first item. And please return it as a Word file, not a PDF. There's a Dropbox in the assignment section of Blackboard. Please return it there. And you have until the 17th. Please return the file as a Word file. No matter how many times I've said it in the past, I've always had, I say, one or two times or three times or four times, people return about 10% return PDFs. Please Word file. So basically, today, any questions about the exam or any other items? I think next Monday is our last class. So I'm talking about HR stuff today, and we'll continue on with that next time. Any questions about anything? The best way to answer the exam questions is right out of the textbook. So you should read the textbook, understand it, and answer the questions based on the textbook reading. Okay, are there any questions about the exam?
Morning, Professor Brandon.
Hey, Brent.
One question. How many questions do we have in the test? In the
There's
exam?
45 questions.
45.
Okay.
And are there like multiple choice or
Some are
like we have
multiple choice, some are true false.
all right, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Nobody? All right. Let me close this. Who can tell me what what human resource management is? Anyone know? Can anyone define it? No one? Anyone? How about Alexander? Can
Can you
Alexander,
repeat the question?
what is HR, human resource management?
It's dealing with people.
Okay, it's company policies concerning people, and it
Can I
includes,
also answer? Sorry.
please, yeah, Ludley, go ahead.
It's for employees, and it also it helps with like training people. Also, like you said, with developing policies. And it has like different various it helps with like recruitment. Um, it also helps with like benefits for the employers.
Very good. Okay, those are all
And
good.
it helps with career development. Sorry. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, Ludley hit a lot of the specifics. Alexander was right too. It has to do with employees. Basically, they're both in my HR classes, so that's why I called on them. So basically, it has to do with anything involving employee related policies, which includes staffing, which means recruiting and selecting employees. It has to do with compensation and retaining employees. It has to do with benefits, which is another aspect of compensation. It has to do with training and development. It has to do with designing jobs, occupational safety and health. There's a whole kind of bag of presents, Christmas bag of items of that's in HR. They're not always connected to each other. A big part of HR, HR is often okay, Jack Wu said everyone in the workforce to create a positive work environment. Very true, Jack. That's a good point too. So they're not always related to each other, but they have they have one thing in common, that they all affect the employees. So you've got a bunch of policies and procedures and economic activities, pay and benefits and job design that concern employees. So let me just review for a second the building blocks that Tushman and O'Reilly talk about. Okay. I have mentioned this in the past. Basically, you could argue that there are 4 building blocks. That first of all, we talked about the structure, the organizational structure. Second of all, the culture of the organization. We talked about last time. Third of all, the technology and the production process. We don't talk a lot about that in this class, but we did talk, of course, about the effects of technology on the organization in general. The course in production management would go into greater detail about production technologies as concerning management, concerning manufacturing. I did talk about TQM a little, I think. And so and also today we're going to talk about HRM, human resource management. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all of these are influenced by the firm's strategy. And in turn, the environment influences everything. So all of these should be in response to the firm's environment or to the organizations. It may not be a firm. For instance, you might be able to apply this to military organizations, as we talk about with 12 o'clock high a little. So basically, the environment shapes the strategy as well as the responses to the strategy. And I think I mentioned last time that these building blocks arguably respond to the strategy, but I think it's also true that they create the strategy, that given a certain type of organization and a certain culture and a certain way of doing business and certain technologies, that will cause the firm to think about going in certain strategic directions. So it's a mutual process, and that's generally true of all of these variables. They all interact. And so also it's true that the strategy, as well as the structure, the HRM, the culture, and the technology, should all be responsive to the firm's environment. And when the environment changes, the strategy changes. The Porter was the one who kind of took elementary economic theory and said you can use this to manage companies. And in particular, he said, given the different environments that firms face, and he called the environments the 5 forces, among other things. We're talking about economics. but it's also true of things like government and demographics and legal issues and cultural issues are also part of the environment as well. But he said that there are 5 forces that influence the firm, and these include ease of entry into the firm's markets, the substitutability of other products for the firm's products, competitive rivalry, the extent that there's competition, that they go head to head in the marketplace. And this could be due to there being a lot of competitors, or it could be due to intense rivalry between some large competitors. So if you look at Coke and Pepsi, no one would deny that those two are at each other's throats all the time competing, but it's a different kind. It's more of a monopolistic competition. They're 2 large firms. Of course, if another firm tries to enter the cola market, they'll gang up on the third firm. So, the soda market is very, and drink market is very, because they're in more than just soda, is very competitive. Although there aren't a large numbers, it doesn't fit the model of perfect competition, but it is a highly competitive market. But, yesterday I was showing my HR class a video about the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire, which it was a pivotal industrial catastrophe in the history of New York. And one of the points in the video that one of the economic historians makes is, who were interviewed, is that the industry was characterized by intense laissez-faire free market competition, which forced the firms into paying low wages and competing aggressively for labor. So clearly what that guy was claiming was that the economic environment of the labor market in the garment center in New York, in the garment business in New York, was heavily influenced by the competitiveness of the business. Now, one effect of that, of course, was that New York was a dominant force in the global clothing industry in terms of manufacturing. And at that time, New York had something like 600,000 manufacturing jobs. Those jobs have largely gone and left New York in response to the regulation. So in other words, the regulation ended the laissez-faire capitalism and the competition, but it also ended the jobs. And so the jobs disappeared and moved to Bangladesh, and to China, and to whatever, Brazil, whatever you had, what have you, Mexico, and so on, Indonesia. And so a lot of the problems of industrialization are brought to those third world countries, and the workers in those countries suffer in the same ways that, or maybe worse, actually, than the American workers did. And an example of that, of course, was in 2011, there was a massive industrial catastrophe in Bangladesh. I always forget the name of the place. It was the Rana Plaza collapse, which killed, I think it was 1,100 people. 1,134 was the death count, much larger than the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire, which had like something like 150 or 60, 140 to 160 people. And in the Rani Plaza catastrophe, it's more like 1,100. So these things haven't gone away by any means. They've been exported, basically. But in any case, the idea of the order model is that these different building blocks and the environments, and I mentioned the 5 forces, I should also mention the different strategies that firms can adopt. And he argues that there are four basic competitive strategies: cost, differentiation, cost focus. All right, I'll just leave that. Yeah. Cost focus and differentiation focus. And so these four strategies are how the firms cope with the environment and the five forces, and they in turn impinge on all of the building blocks: how firms manage their HR, how firms manage, what kind of structure they have, what kind of technology they adopt, are all going to be in response to the environment and so on. Just to give you one example, I was talking about in the 9:30 class that, I can bring that up to this this dimension, or in that class I talked about it later, is the minimum wage. The minimum wage was raised about 5 or 6 years ago, something like that, 7 years ago, whatever. And New York, I'm going to check that year minimum wage raised, New York, 15. So it was 2007. So it's 6 years ago, as I said. And it was raised to 11, and then 3 years ago to 15. And basically, what does the minimum wage do? Obviously, it raises wages for a lot of people who were previously getting less, but it also increases the unemployment rate. And part of the way it does that is that it encourages firms to replace labor with technology. So what you've seen in the years since when that law was passed, I bought stock in the firm called the National Cash Register, NCR, which makes those barcode checkout things, because I figured the demand for those things would go up as the cashier's wages went up. They'd start using more of those machines. And I was right, the stock went up and I sold it. But basically, what happens if you raise the minimum wage, the firms will replace labor with technology to cut down on the cost. And it has a similar effect to what unions do. I was talking in the earlier session about unions, and one of the effects of unions is that they encourage firms, because unions raise wages. It's unquestionably true that they do, but what the firms do in response is that they use more technology. They use more capital investment, so they'll buy machines to replace the employees. So when they began to raise the minimum wage in some states in as I said 7 years ago, the firms in retail industries, especially where there were large numbers of low-paid employees making less than that, began to replace the labor demand for capital equipment demand. And they began using these barcode checkout things and other machinery that reduces the demand for labor. At the time, I said I went to a meeting of the Labor and Employment Relations Association in 2015. That was the last time I ever went there. They didn't like. I always had a tense relationship with some of that crew, and they had a session that was devoted to largely attacking me. So I didn't go back. But one of the points I made in one of the sessions there was that the passage of these minimum wage laws. At that time, they were being passed in the West Coast a lot, California, Washington, and then also in New York and some of the other mostly Democratic Party run states, was that it was kind of irrational expectations because there was massive inflationary policy making still going on from the bailouts of the 2008 and 9 a Great Recession, you might call it. And there was what was called quantitative easing and the twist, and there had been large-scale money printing. And I suggested that the raises in the minimum wage were kind of rational expectations because there would be inflation, which would in turn erode the minimum wage back towards what it had been before these increases. And it took a few years. I wasn't right on the timing, but I was right, as you can see now, that there's been a great deal of inflation, and a part of that was due to COVID. However, the increases in the minimum wage, I think, did not have the expected effects on employment levels because of the demographics that we're facing now. And this is a huge part of the environment that HR people are facing. So in other words, if you look at the, I'm not going to give you an exact rendition of it, but if you look at the employment rate since 1970, it kind of peaked around 2000 and has gone down. It's not a smooth curve like this or anything, but I'm just giving you an idea. And it's kind of gone down, and it went up a little recently. But the actual trend has been down, and there's a very simple explanation for it, which is that the boomers were a larger generation than the subsequent generations, and the boomers are getting older, and so they're leaving the workforce. So you have a smaller percent of workers working now. Now that, of course, is going to mean that the unemployment rate gets lower, because if you have people leaving the workforce, they're not counted in the unemployment rate, and so you have a continually smaller share of people in the active labor pool, and demand for labor is going to be increasing. It's not that demand, I said that wrong, that the supply of labor, I meant to say, is going to be declining for the very same reason that there are fewer workers that they're leaving. So this thing with immigration, it's actually the firms want immigration because they understand that the labor pool is diminishing. Now, of course, employees who work don't like immigration. So, and there's good reason for that. If you're a worker, you're not going to like immigration because that creates more labor competition. So traditionally, the unions actually opposed immigration. It wasn't a racism issue. It was the unions presumably do the things that benefit their workers, but it's been turned into this political hot potato, and it's now like very charged. And so a lot of the unions that traditionally opposed immigration now favor it for other reasons. And I don't want to get into the politics of it. It's not really related to HR stuff, but basically, these are very complicated questions. And Brendan, go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off, Professor.
No.
My question is, based on logic, right? And the data that you just talked about, are you saying now is like the best time to get into HR or HRM as a job wise?
It's a good field. I don't know what the best time is or was, but it's a good time. I do recommend HR as a field. I think I worked in it. To be honest, I didn't enjoy my career that much, but I had other issues. I felt I was like a little too trapped, that it was too narrow. But looking back on it, I think I should have had a broader mind about it. But it was also my personality. I would say overall, it's an excellent field, and it's a good time to get into it. I think like a lot of the changes we've been talking about, such as gig work, increased use of technology, increased trade-offs between technology and labor, uh, more contractual relations. I think all of that stuff will mean that there's more need for HR. Somebody's got to write the contract. Somebody's got to hire the gig workers. Somebody's got to assess who's doing a good job and who's not. All this has got to be HR. So, I think it's a very good field, Brandon, to get into. Does that address what you wanted to know?
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Okay. Any other questions about it or anything? So basically, so I was talking about the building blocks, and HR really came to play a bigger role in business in the 1960s. It had been growing. If you watch that old movie, Miracle on 34th Street, and you got to see the original, which is always better. And one of the villain in that movie is the personnel director who insists on giving Santa Claus a mental test and determines that he's insane because he thinks he's Santa Claus. But of course, he really is Santa Claus, but that's another story. But basically, the villain in that movie, which was made in the 1940s, was the HR department. And so it was already going on. And, the HR field had its origins in part in the IQ testing that was done on World War I GIs and the military folks. And it also had roots in the social work field. And a lot of the big companies where I worked, International Nickel, employed a great number of immigrant and foreign miners, as well as it was a multicultural thing, because there were a lot of French-speaking miners from Quebec there, as well as immigrants and others. And they used to have a whole social work department that would visit the miners at their homes and make sure that they were adjusting to American life. And this was part of the origin of HR. If you read Sanford Jacoby's book, Employing Bureaucracy, he talks about this, and how the settlement houses in New York, it's still there, the Henry Street settlement. I just went for a walk with my wife down to the South Street Seaport, and we went through that. We passed a lot of their buildings. It's still a big thing. And in Chicago, Hull House, founded by Jane Addams. And all these things were part of the origins of the human resource management field. But and also I have to mention, most importantly, more than even any of the other ones I just mentioned, was the labor unions. That labor unions pushed for improvement in working conditions throughout the 19th century in various ways, but they didn't become standardized in America and sort of made more stable until the later part of the 19th century, with the formation of the AFL by Samuel Gompers and Adolf Strasser, two members of the Cigar Makers Union, which I think does not, I haven't heard about it anyway. If it exists, it's not very big. And basically, Gompers was British, and he imported really a British style of unionism to America, and he organized the craft. So it would have been the construction workers and the people like the carpenters and the plumbers and things like that. And the FFL was at most moderately successful. They created a stable labor movement, but it was only by the 1920s, it was only about 8% of the labor force, which ironically, if you look at the percentage of private sector workers organized in the labor force now, it's about the same. I'd have to look up the exact number, but it goes down every year. Union density has fallen since the 1940s. And part of the reason for that, I'll just inject, is the increasing white collar work, that most people now want to go to college and get white collar jobs. The blue collar jobs, the factory jobs where there were a lot of union workers, have gone overseas. And as I said in my HR class yesterday, this has paralleled as the extent of regulation and labor costs increased, jobs increasingly emigrated from the US. But I would also say that this was also encouraged by the monetary policies of the Fed, which reduced interest rates and made it very convenient and low cost to invest in new plant and equipment overseas. If you can borrow at 0%, there's no limit to how many new plants you can build. And so there were very few constraints on firms saying, well, we've got high cost labor here in America, low cost in China. Let's invest in some plants in China and boost our profit margin. And so basically a lot of plants, I think there's a combination of factors, but certainly, I was just looking just a minute ago at migration around the States. And, the fact is that a lot of people have left New York, also to a lesser degree, California, and have migrated to places like Wyoming and Florida, where there are lower costs. Of course, Florida is now becoming more expensive, and Peter Thiel, the billionaire, just said he wasn't going to move to Florida because the labor costs in Florida are now becoming higher than California. So basically, that's undoing. These things tend to balance out. But the thing is, whenever you push up costs, you're going to cause firms to exit, and that's a lot of the impetus for the globalization that we saw. Now there was a reaction to it, and there were imposition of tariffs under Trump, which the Democrats have continued, Biden's continued. And so you continue to see high tariffs, which means that firms will likely move back to the US to some degree. But the problem is that we already have escalating labor costs, and with a declining labor force participation rate due to the demographics, I'm not sure of the wisdom of imposing tariffs on imports when at a time when you've got very low unemployment and you have declining labor force participation. But in any case, getting back to HR and where it came from, so I gave you some of the early influences, but where really the pivotal point was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which legalized the discrimination that was common in terms of gender. It was out in the open. There was gender discrimination was not hidden. When I was a child, 64, I was 10 years old. So say when I was 8 or 9, there were ads in the newspaper, help wanted ads. This was before the internet, of course. Help wanted female and help wanted male. And they openly had different kinds of categories for jobs. In the North, they didn't discriminate on account of race. They didn't do it openly, of course. There's probably, in fact, certainly quietly done, but not openly. In the South, I think it was open. And basically, the Civil Rights Act said all of this has to go, that there's no discrimination on account of race, religion, national origin, color, and gender. And basically what that did was it told firms, you need people to help make clear that your firm isn't going to discriminate, because Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, of huge importance to companies to this day, says that you can't discriminate on account of those 5 reasons. So this led to an explosion in interest in HR. And if you watch the movie, the TV series Mad Men, which I highly recommend, really excellent. It's about the advertising field from 1960 to 1970, and it's got, there's some very, 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 very loose connection to reality. I mean, a lot of these things did go on. And I think the people who wrote it did a lot of research and or mirror reality, but the stories, of course, are fictional. But they bring in the real world firm. So they depict him developing an advertising campaign for Lucky Strike and an advertising campaign for Eastman Kodak and so on. And the ad campaigns directly parallel what was actually done. I remembered some of the ads. I mean, I was old enough in those days to remember the TV ads, and that they were showing how they were developed. I don't know how accurate the technical aspects of it are, but what the series is about is how the firm starts out as all WASP, all white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. There were no Jews they were advertising. There were Jews were big in advertising, but they had their own firms or separate firms between Jews and WASPs. And then there were no blacks anywhere, and very few Italians. There was one Italian working there, and so on. And so, absolutely no Hispanics or blacks. And so basically, it evolves over the 10 years, and you see the changes. And one of the main characters, Peggy Olson, starts as a secretary, and no one even thinks you could have a female copywriter, but she gradually accrues this responsibility and is backed by the hero. And by the end of the series, she's a big, famous copywriter. So basically, this was what went on in the 60s, and in that you saw the increasing importance of HR in terms of making sure that firms didn't violate the technical aspects of the Civil Rights Act. And there were other laws passed in the late 60s and 70s, and these included the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which eliminated discrimination on account of age if you're over 40. And then in the late 70s, said you can't mandate retirement, and then said first they raised the mandatory retirement age to 70, the earliest you were allowed, and then they did away with it altogether. So it happened in a few steps, but basically, you can see in the ADEA that these laws aren't adhered to in a lot of cases. That I'm 68. If I went to apply for an entry-level job at some corporation, I would not get it because of my age. So basically, it's really not true that these laws, the fact that a law is passed doesn't mean that behavior changes. But, that what is true is that they eliminated mandatory retirement. When I was in industry, let's say I started at Inco in 1976, it was everybody had to retire at age 65. I was in the retirement area. I was processing retirements of people age 65. They worked until 65, and then they had to retire. But life expectancy has extended. When the Social Security Act was passed in the mid 1930s during the Depression, people people often, their age 60 life expectancy was less than it is now. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but it was less than it is now. So age 60 life expectancy has extended significantly. And so people live longer. And so mandating retirement at age 65 probably is not wise because it's expensive. Now, if you look at the aspect of retirement and the cost, what mandating retirement at age 65 does is it greatly increases the cost of retiring. But at the same time, what it does is it tells the employers that they have flexibility in keeping people there for a long time because they know that eventually they'll leave, they'll be forced to leave. If you do away with that, then it becomes less palatable to the companies to have long-term employment. If you say to your employee, you can work here for your whole life until you retire. If there's a mandatory retirement at age 65, the most they're going to be stuck with someone is probably about 40 years, usually much less. If there's no mandatory retirement, then the extent becomes much larger and the financial risk becomes much greater. So I don't know whether it was coincidental or there was some unconscious adaptation, but the companies did away with long-term employment relationships at the same time that the Age Discrimination and Employment Act eliminated mandatory retirement. And so what we've seen now, of course, this trend would have happened no matter what because of the rise in technology and the gig employment. And you might say, well, maybe it was just kind of like like I was saying with the minimum wage, like they passed it because they knew it wouldn't matter, kind of thing. But what basically happened was that technology has gradually reduced the extent of long-term employment at the same time that the laws now guarantee long-term employment. But in any case, if you look at what's happened, I could talk about a lot of different areas in HR. One of the really big ones is pay, compensation. And the simple truth is that workers in America have not received a pay raise when adjusted for inflation since 1970 or so. Some years it goes up, some years it goes down, but since the early 70s, American workers have not really received an inflation-adjusted pay raise. And this goes counter to how human resources were managed throughout the history of the American economy. So if you start at 1800, which was pre-laissez-faire, it was still, labor was still in large part regulated by the Elizabethan statutes that we inherited. So in other words, labor unions were viewed as criminal conspiracies, for example, and there were still a lot of restrictions on firing and hiring. Roads were typically built by labor that was drafted. So in other words, if you lived in a town and they needed a road, they would say, well, able-bodied males must appear to build this road, or something like that. these are alien things that existed in the colonial era and were continued into the early 19th century. If you start from that phase, and of course there was slavery and indentured servitude. If you start from that phase into the 1960s, the real wages of labor tended to increase year in and year out by between 0.5% and 2% a year. So every year, adjusted for inflation, people would, on average, get, let's say, 1% pay increases. Some years it might be 2%, some years it might be 0.5%. That ended around 1970, and the reason was that we created a paper money system that's not backed by gold. So our money supply is totally fiat currency. There's no backing of our money, which enabled unlimited monetary expansion, which in turn causes inflation, as we've seen recently. The inflation then undermines wage increases and cancels them. This was recognized by a number of economists, most famously by John Maynard Keynes in his book, The General Theory of Employment and Employment, Interests, and Money, I think it's the title is. And if you look in the early if you look in the early chapters of the book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And if you look early in the book, in the first chapter or two, he talks about money illusion and that workers will go on strike if you give them a pay cut, which was characteristic of the 19th century. That was a large theme in labor history, was the violent strikes in response to pay cuts that were occurring during a deflationary period. There was actual deflation, not inflation, deflation from, let's say 1870. It was called the crime of 73 at the time. And Milton Friedman's written about it, and others at the time, that the country went from a gold and silver standard. In the Civil War, it had a paper money standard, which was highly inflationary. And then to counteract the inflation, the mugwumps, if they were called, there's a whole lot of interesting history about the Gilded Age, that the leaders, the Republican leaders at that time, because the Republican Party was dominant at the federal level in that period, because the Democrats were aligned with the Confederacy and had lost. If you in 1873, they adopted a gold standard because there was inflation due to the Civil War. The paper money greenbacks that were created during the Civil War is true in both North and South. And this caused deflation, and that was when you had lots of violent strikes with the deflation. But the truth is that real wages were increasing during that period. One of the things that really you may not understand if you're a student, it took me years to figure this out. If you read the labor history, they talk about all the labor violence and how the employees were always getting pay cuts and they were abused. But if you read the general economic history, they talk a lot about the gold standard and the monetary deflation. And the labor history people don't integrate the two things. So it sounds like the strikes were coming out of thin air and there was all this abuse, but it was actually, a lot of it was simple deflation. And the employees were making less in nominal terms because wages and prices were falling, but in deflation adjusted terms, they were making more. And there were significant real wage increases during that period. The savings rate in America at that time was 30%. Now it's like 4% or something. And people were able to save money. There were no income taxes also. The income tax began in 1913. So they were able to put away a lot more money. And of course, they didn't have the security and the pension plans. For the most part, they didn't have. American Express started a profit sharing plan in the 1870s, but in general, most workers didn't have such benefits. And so there were a lot of violent strikes. But what's happened since 1970 is that they've done away. It's the opposite of having adopted the gold standard, where you have deflation with increasing real wages and possibly declining nominal wages. What you have instead is increasing nominal wages that are canceled out by inflation, and so stagnant real wages. And just as Keynes predicted, he was absolutely right that what he said was that there, for some reason, workers object to a wage cut and become upset and even violent, but they don't object to an inflation that erodes their wages, so they don't get any wage increase. They object to the one, in other words, if you have rising inflation adjusted wages, which is the real issue, but declining nominal wages, workers will be disruptive. But if you have stagnant real wages, but rising nominal wages, workers will be peaceful. And this was predicted by Keynes and many others, and it turned out to be right. And so what this actually turned out to be was harmful to the workforce and beneficial to capital. So in other words, if you own capital, increasing the money supply is going to increase your returns. There are a lot of reasons for it, but chiefly the discount rate goes down, the present value of future returns goes up, lower discount rate, higher present value of future returns. Stocks are just present values of future returns, so lowest interest rates boost future returns. That's why the stock prices fell when Jay Powell raised interest rates last year. And when interest rates go back down, you're going to see, well, you've already seen, partially because of the bailout of SVB and other bank bailouts. It was a big bank bailout that the Fed said they're going to give loans for any bond that any bank has down to value of 0. They will give them the par value of the bond, which means any bank can easily borrow with limited collateral from the Fed. So it's going to be virtually impossible for a bank to go bankrupt at this point. But the banking system is in serious trouble. I was just reading the Kiplinger letter, which I subscribe to, that maybe it was there. I'm not sure. No, maybe it wasn't there. It was somewhere else. But in any case, it was a reliable source that there's something like 700 banks who've lost half their capital in the last year. So that means that the reserves are down by 50%. That means the risk of default is high. That's a huge number of banks. Over 700 banks in America are facing potential bank runs. So we're not out of the problem. And the thing is, if the Fed, to the extent that the Fed subsidizes the banks, it's going to mean more inflation. More inflation means that real wages decline further. And, people will be unhappy. So we'll see what happens. I don't know. But in any case, what we've seen since 1971, when Nixon ended the gold standard, is a stagnant real wages. And I think one of the effects of this has been declining interest in unionization. I know in theory you would think that if wages are high, wages are strong, people will be more likely to join unions. But I think what has happened is that the depressed real wages have created far more demand for labor. And this is in despite of the technology and the plant relocations that low interest rates facilitate. In other words, if you have low interest rates, capital investment is going to escalate. You can borrow and invest. And so you're going to see more and more capital investment, and that means more technology. So there's been overinvestment in technology and overinvestment in plant relocations, both of which require capital investment. So basically what that's done is reduce wages, so that despite these forces that are causing unemployment, the reduction in wages has spurred high labor demand, because wages are depressed from where they would be in a market economy. Wages are significantly below where the market rate would be. And so basically, I think the unemployment rate has been low, and those two go together. And, just to be clear, these are not due to presidential personalities, or this guy got elected so the unemployment rate is low. Trump claimed that, and Biden now claims it. And basically it's people who believe that are economic illiterates. It's it's clearly unrelated to who the president is. It has to do with how much money the Fed is printing, which the president will deny they control, although I think there's probably an influence. It's indirect. So basically, human resource management has had an easy time of basically attracting labor, because their wages are relatively low, and it's easy to pay people. The companies don't face a lot of problems. And I think this has deprived unions. People aren't interested in unions because the labor market has been increasingly flexible. They can change jobs. There's a lot of labor demand, and so they don't see the need for unions. But I mean, the decline in unionism is also due, without a doubt, to first of all, the increasing white collar nature of the workforce. As people have gone into college, they want white collar jobs, so they're not likely to join unions. There's also been the exodus of American manufacturing to overseas plants, which also reduces demand for unions. And another factor is the regulations that I was talking about that have expanded protections for employees, so they don't really need a union as much as they once did. Not that unions protected people from discrimination. A lot of the unions in those days, back before the Civil Rights Act, contributed to the discrimination. The Southern unions didn't want Black workers, and Gompers and his successors and the FFL and then the AFL-CIO had to cope with this large racist element in the Southern labor movement. And that was true until, the last few decades. So basically, though, getting back to the relationship between unions and regulation and laws, laws like things like protecting people against discrimination, protecting people against arbitrary treatment, protecting people's pensions, say, by ERISA, that all of this stuff may make people, I don't know if it really does, but it makes people feel a little safer, and they don't really need the union to the degree that they might have in the past. So basically, I'm sort of getting a little mixed up as what I talked about in the last class. I don't have my notes in front of me, what I was talking about in the last class and what I've been talking about in this class. But basically, if you look at the forces that led to the Civil Rights Act, there was a great deal of discrimination leading up to it. And that was then eliminated. You had increasing professionalization of HR, and then additional laws were passed in the 1960s and 1970s, and all of them led to the need for more HR people. So some of the laws that were passed besides the ADEA, the American, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, some of the other ones were ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. In the early 90s, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and in the early 70s, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And all of these laws contributed to workers feeling that they had greater protections than they had in the past. Now, let me take attendance. We've still got about 10 minutes, but if I finish, we'll do a little bit more discussion about our plans. Some people came in late, so I'll just repeat what I said in the beginning. Farhad Abdul.
I'm here.
Hello, Farhad. Ahmed Alkor.
I'm here.
Hello. Muhammad Afi. Mohammed Afi. Here? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here, Professor.
Yeah, okay. I see. Jenna. Jenna. Joseph Catanzaro.
I'm here, Professor. I'm here.
Hello, Joseph.
Hello.
Hello. Jiamin Chen.
I'm here.
Hello, Jiamin. Janine.
I'm here.
Hello, Janine. Hermia.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello. David Estorovsky.
I'm here, Professor.
Hey, David. Monica Garcia.
Here.
Hello. Lex Marimar.
Here.
Hello. Alexia.
Here.
Hello. Kanie.
Here.
Hello. Yusuf.
I'm here.
Hello. Georgie.
Here.
Hello. Summerland. Summer. Hangjian Lin.
Here.
Hello. Hamdi Mali.
Here.
Hello. Ludley.
Here.
Hello. Famita.
I'm
Emmanuel.
here, Professor.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
Famita, I have Emmanuel.
Here.
Emmanuel. Raquel. Jishan Rowan.
Here.
Hello.
Raquel.
Hello, Raquel. Brendan.
Here, Professor.
Hello. Aaliyah.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello. Stacy.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Denasia.
Here.
Hello. Jack Wu.
Here.
Hello. Yichuan Zhang.
Here.
Hello. Yayin Zhang.
I'm here, Professor.
Oh, yeah. Matthew.
Here.
Hello. Taryn.
Hi, here.
Hi, Taryn. Christian.
Good morning, Professor. I'm here.
Good morning. Janaya.
Here.
Hello. Alexander.
Here.
Hello, Alexander.
Hi.
Jack.
Here, Professor. Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, okay, so the only two I have Jenna Bell.
I'm
And
here. I'm
oh,
here, Jenna Bell.
yes, Jenna. And Summer.
Yeah,
Summer Lamb. Okay, she's usually here. She's not today. Okay, so all right. We'll continue with the talk on HR next time, so I'll let you go. Our exam is posted in the course document section. Please return it as a Word file to the assignment section. There's like a digital Dropbox there. And you have until the 17th, midnight on the 17th, to finish it, so you have a lot of time. The best way to study is to read the textbook, and you'll find the answers right in the textbook. Okay, so that said, I'll let you out a little early. Have a nice afternoon. If there are any questions, please stick around and I will be glad to answer them.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Take care, everybody.
Hey, Professor, I got a question.
Yeah.
More so like a concern, like, I have not been able to do the discussion board for June 12th, the last discussion board. Does it work?
The discussion board for June 12th.
Was it? Yeah, I think it's June 12th. I have not been able to do that yet.
No, there's no June 12th is after the semester end. Which discussion board are you thinking of?
That's
You mean
the last one.
12th?
I just have not done it yet because of.
You couldn't access the discussion board. I will check.
Yeah, I'm gonna like. I'm just gonna let you know. I mean, I'm just trying to let you know that I'm gonna try to get into you by like Wednesday.
Okay. Let me know if there's a problem. I'll look at it and see.
Yeah.
All right. There's a lot of
Got it. Thank you.
you are, so I'm having trouble hearing you, but basically, I'll look on the discussion board to make sure if you post late, I'll give you partial credit. So you can go ahead and do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll see you later.
Any other questions? Any other questions?
I have a question, Professor.
No.
The fog war, I missed that discussion board because
Okay.
due to health reasons, I could provide documents if you'd
All
like.
right. You
Is
can
there a
just
way?
go ahead and do it. I'll give you credit.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I didn't really mean to miss it. It was just a lot going on.
Okay. Don't worry, it happens.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Georgie? You're the last of the last.
No, I just stayed here. No, sorry.
All right, take care. Be
You
well.
too. Bye bye.